lines are moving up and down. We're okay. Okay, praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Well, when we start talking about the prayer shawl, I have to tell you, I've read the Bible through, and I've never seen anything that said prayer shawl or anything that I recognized as prayer shawl. You know, I was going to tell you all, I was going to tell you this funny thing God did this week. I have had several things just going wrong for me. It just seemed like little things, just picky things, all just going wrong for me. And then this last week, I had a couple really big things go wrong. For one thing, I was a millionaire for about 30 minutes. The Publishers Clearinghouse called me. Miss Carole, we have a special senior winner. It's not the $5,000 a week, but it is $1 million and a white Mercedes. And talked to Louis, what are you going to do with all this money? Of course, he said, I'll just farm till it's all gone, you know. But that's an inside joke. Y'all don't understand farming if you don't get that one. And after about 30 minutes, and he told me the prize patrol was right down the street waiting to bring me the roses and everything. And then he said, all you have to do is send me the taxes on it. Prepay the taxes on it. Well, you know, immediately, that's a scam. You know, and I just hung up. But for about 30 minutes, I was a millionaire. We were millionaires. And then later on, that same day, I came in the house. We'd been gone somewhere, and I had my little blinker on. My answering machine was going, and I pushed the button, and it said, if you do not call the IRS immediately, you will be arrested. Call this number or you will be arrested. Well, I just erased it, and I thought, later that day, I'm just talking to God, you know, and I said, God, why don't people just do what they know to do? And he just dropped in my spirit, just like he was talking to me. I know what you mean. Can you imagine God dealing with that kind of stuff from us every day? You know, why don't we just do what we know that we're supposed to do? Why don't we just keep our nose clean and do good things? Did you get it today? Oh boy, they got our number. They got our number, I'll tell you for sure. I became interested in the prayer shawl several years ago, and when I researched this, I'm going to tell you. Kimmy, Dave, do you have the one that has the heading prayer shawl on it? Can you put it up on the overhead? No, it says prayer shawl on it, just printing. Yeah. Okay. The names that the prayer shawl is referred to in the Bible: coat, cloak, robe, blanket, sheet, girdle, mantle, or tent. Those names all refer to the prayer shawl. Now, I didn't know that. One of the funny things that I discovered in researching particularly this is when the King James group got together, the priests, and they translated from Hebrew and Greek into English. It's not the same English we speak. It's an old English that the words don't always make the same meaning anymore. I'll give you an example. I'm kind of a word doer. I do crossword puzzles and things and work with words a lot. And in the process of doing crossword puzzles, I came across this. what is the word for bribe? Old English word for bribe is sop. Wow, that makes that story about Jesus and the disciples sitting around the table and Jesus being asked, who's going to betray you, Lord? And he says, the one that takes the sop. Well, we think of that. If you look in Webster's, there's two meanings for sop. The first one is to dunk a piece of bread in the wine. The second one is a bribe, Old English. Wow, that made that clear to me. You know, who knew that? Who knew that word sop meant bribe? But it doesn't in our language today, but it did back in Old English. And so as we go through some of these scriptures and we look at the stories that go with them, you may just have to use your imagination on some of them. When the woman with the issue of the blood comes to Jesus and she says, I just need to touch the hem of his garment. From the hem of his garment is the same word that's used for the fringe on the prayer shawl. It got translated hem this time instead of fringe. So we'll see about making some of these things a little bit more clear. The words to remember. The prayer shawl is called a talit. Now, Adam, you help me say that right, because I want to call it a tallit, but I know it's a talit, and I don't always say it right, so you help me, Adam. Okay, literally it means little tent. Talit, little tent. The tzitzit are the four corners long fringe. You notice there's four long fringes and then a bunch of little short fringes. Okay, these are called tzitzit. T-S-I-T-S-I-T. Tzitzit. There you go. That is the long four-cornered fringe. And the techelet, that's the blue-colored string that is supposed to be in the fringe. So those are words that we will be using, and you will see how what they mean. I became interested in the prayer shawl several years ago watching John Hagee. I don't know if any of you have ever watched John Hagee, but he ministered. He had been to Israel, and he came back, and he had a prayer shawl, and he taught us about the prayer shawl. And I thought, wow, my interest was stirred up again when I went to a Women Aglow meeting, and they had a program that was titled The Bride of Christ. And they featured the prayer shawl there. And I thought, you know, God's just telling me something. I need to find out about this prayer shawl. I really want to know about it. And I came home and I began to look into what I could discover about the prayer shawl. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit. If you notice right at the top around my neck, there's a band. Can you see the band around my neck? Okay, that indicates that's where that's supposed to be. And when you put this on, the proper way to put it on is you hold it over your head and you recite this prayer, this blessing. Praise the Eternal One, O my soul. O God, you are very great. Arrayed in glory and majesty, you wrap yourself in light as with a garment and stretch out the heavens like a curtain. We praise you, eternal God, sovereign of the universe. You hallow us with your mitzvot and teach us to wrap ourselves in the fringed talit. And then you can put it on. Okay, now, this particular piece of clothing began as a common piece of clothing. It was just a square of material that in the Middle East it was just common garb. It's what they wore. They did not wear structured clothing. When it says coat, it's not a coat like what we would have seams down and arms in. It is just a shawl. And even today, if you've gone to the Middle East or seen pictures from the Middle East, you see most of the people have something over their head. Most of the native people to the Middle East they wear something over their head, sometimes with a little thing to hold it, but it's based basically on this piece of clothing that was common in that part of the country. Also, and I don't know anything about this, but the Catholic priest wears a robe that comes from the prayer shawl. It's his prayer shawl. So it's used today. Back then, the people in the Middle East used their prayer shawl, a large square or oblong piece of cloth is all it was. And you remember the scripture that said, if a man gives you his cloak for a loan, when it comes to nighttime, give it back to him? Well, that's because that was his blanket. Not only did he wear that robe during the day, but he wrapped up in it at night, and he slept in it. That was his blanket. So you didn't keep that man's blanket away from him at night. If he gave it to you for security on that loan, you had to give it back to him at night. And so this little piece of fabric was a common thing in the Middle East in the early days. It didn't become important until God told Moses what to do with it. Okay, so I'm a real history buff, especially biblical history. I'm one who reads the begats with interest. I like to know the genealogies of the Bible. And as I read, I realized, hey, Abraham is fifth great-grandson of Noah. Hey, that's not very long. In 5 generations, the man Noah, who had such faith in God as to build an ark, his family is now in the Ur of the Chaldees, which is present-day Iraq, worshiping a moon god named Allah, A-L-L-A-H. And I can see why God would go to that line, that lineage, to pull somebody out to make a nation for himself. And he called Abraham. Pastor has said many times, he may have called other people, but Abraham responded. Abraham responded to him. And so, because I don't know Hebrew and I don't know Greek, and our Bible doesn't always translate each word exactly like it was written, I was dependent on other people to tell me about, someone to lead me into the knowledge that, and I really respect John Hagee, and I watch Perry Stone. I don't know if you all ever watch Perry Stone, but he kind of makes things just come alive over there in Israel. And so ultimately I did research on the internet. The meaning of the prayer shawl has virtually been lost to Christians, but also to Jews. I was giving this program at a meeting in Wewoka at Omega Alpha Ministries, and friends of ours, Pam and Gary Chesser, they've been here to speak before, and they're missionaries to Israel. And I said, Gary, you probably know more about this than I do. I'm a little bit in awe. You need to be up here teaching this, not me. And he just smiled at me, and after the meeting, he said, Carole, what I know about the prayer shawl, you just taught me. He said, it's lost. Only the old men wear the prayer shawl in Israel. And it has been relegated to only ceremonial places. He said, however, I would see old Jewish men on the streets, and they'd have their prayer shawl on, and they'd cover their head, and they'd be like this standing on the streets, And I never knew why. And I said, well, Gary, what's the Bible call that? He said, that's their prayer closet. That's their prayer closet. That, believe me, they had no closet in their house. They didn't have clothes that they hung in their closet. Their prayer closet was a place that they separated themselves from the world, that they went into God's presence, and they covered themselves completely with this prayer shawl, and that's where they escaped the world and came into God's presence. The meaning has virtually been lost to not only Christians but to the Jews. I've read the whole Bible and never seen anything about it. Let's look at Numbers 15, 37 to 41. Do we have that, Kimmy? Can you pull that up in King James? Numbers 15, 37 through 41. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, that they put upon the fringe of the borders a ribbon of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and that you seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which ye use to go a-whoring, that you may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy unto your God. I, the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, to be your God. I am the Lord your God. And so God is telling Moses, have the people put fringes on their cloak, on their coat, on mantle, whatever you want to call it. Put fringes on it. And the fringes are to remind you who God is. And all the little fringes here are the 634 commandments that God had given to Moses for the Israelites. And then in Deuteronomy 22:12, it says, Thou shalt make thee fringes upon the four quarters of their vesture, wherewith thou coverest thyself. So he's just telling them again about the fringes to put on. And that's what makes this different. Now, can you bring the fringe up? Very strange. Now, this is God telling his people what to wear. This is not unusual. He told them what to eat. He told them how to worship, how to speak, what to say. He told them how to live. He was setting aside a nation of people for himself. He was setting aside a nation of people for himself. In Hebrew, this garment is called a talit. The word actually is translated little tent. Originally, it was a piece of everyday clothing that a man would wear. It has evolved into a garment worn mostly at religious ceremonies. It is not the square of cloth itself that sets it aside. It's the fringes, or the tzitzit, T-Z-I-T, that distinguishes this garment. God told them, make fringes to look upon them, to remember the commandments. The fringes begin with the four corners. Each corner fringe consists of 4 white strands folded into 8 strands, and 1 blue strand, as God said, put upon the fringe a ribbon of blue. Blue dye was very expensive. Only royalty could afford the blue dye, thus royal blue. That's where the name for that blue came. But even a poor person could afford one blue thread. The Lord intended to show the priesthood of the Jewish nation in that way. The tzitzit or corner fringe is tied a certain way. Every Jewish letter has a number. Some of you may have known about the numerology of the Bible. If any of you have studied the numerology of the Bible. Okay, the code of the Jewish law, which is the Jewish law book, it has all the commandments in there, tells you exactly the requirements for tying the fringe. There are 5 knots and certain numbers of wrappings which spell the name of God or Yahweh or Jehovah. These are called wings. These are called wings. Okay. Kimmy, do you have the Malachi scripture 4? Malachi 4, I think it's 1 and 2. For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. And the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch. But unto you that fear my name shall a Son of righteousness arise with healing in his wings. And ye shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stalk. Oh, healing in his... I wonder what in the world they were talking about. They're talking about the healing in the wings on the prayer shawl. This is and the Jewish people literally believed God inhabited the fringe on their robe. And so they have now the promise of healing in the wings that they have given, that God has given to them. And so the other knotted fringe represents the 613 laws or commandments that God gave the Jews through Moses. Oh, I think it's so interesting to note that God prepared Moses to write the Torah, or the books of the law. The Torah is the first 5 books of our Bible. Moses was educated as an Egyptian. And if you know where the Israelites were at the time of Moses, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. And they were nothing but nomads, just traveling with their sheep, flocks, or herds, whatever. They had no way to be a people at all. They had no knowledge at all. They were just uneducated nomads. And then they went into captivity through Joseph, and they came into Egypt during the famine, and then for 400 years they were captives. So they were not educated. They were slaves. There may have been a few that were slaves maybe in the Pharaoh's castle or something, but the majority of the people that came out of Egypt were uneducated and had very little skill. But Moses was the highest educated person in the land. He was educated to be a Pharaoh. He was educated, and the Egyptians were the most highly educated people in the world at that time. They were mathematicians. They were builders. They were astrologers. They read the heavens. They read the stars before anybody knew anything about the placement of the stars. The Egyptians were studying them. And while the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, they learned to make bricks. They had a skill. They knew how to build buildings. See, they never knew that as wanderers living in tents. They never knew how to build a city. They were not ready to become a nation under God. They had no skills. But Moses had all the skills. And God prepared Moses to bring the people out and teach them the skills. Now, the Egyptians were great record keepers. Everything that they did, they wrote it down. They had a recorder. And when a pharaoh said something, it was his recorder wrote it down, and it's for posterity. They can go back in the archives in Egypt, and there's exactly what this pharaoh said, what he did, the result of it. It's all written down. Well, one of the first things that Moses did was find someone who could write. And that man, that person, probably a man, became his recorder. And everything that Moses said, that man wrote down. Now, we know he wrote 5 books of the Bible. He didn't sit down and write them. He spoke them, and somebody following behind him wrote down everything that Moses said. His recorder did. And then we have the scribes who copied it over, and made more copies of it so that more people could see it. These people have been slaves for 400 years, and literacy was not available to all. Moses was the one who divided the people into their birth tribes. Wow. They had okay, we know there's 12 tribes, don't we? But they weren't divided in tribes as they were slaves in Egypt. They had no knowledge of where they came from. Moses did the genealogy to divide the people into their birth tribes. Let's talk about this prayer shawl. It's present in both the Old Testament and the New. The source of the blue dye, a snail, disappeared after the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. They began using black on the tallit as a sign of mourning until the new temple would be built. After the 6 Days War in 1967, the snails began to appear again along the coast of Israel, along the Mediterranean Sea. They had not been there since 70 A.D. The people were trained, there were people trained in how to extract that dye, and they began extracting that dye. Typically, a tallit is made of wool. Well, the people were shepherds, and their wealth was in their flocks and herds. Later, when they settled into cities, they grew flax and they made linen. The stripes or patterns can be of any color today. The Levitical tribe, who were the priests, wore red. And the picture that we have with the priest with the long red gown. Okay, see the priest over there on that side? That is a priest in his red robe. Now, that's a very large robe. It goes clear down to the ground, and his fringe probably swished on the ground. The richer you were, the more wealth that you had, the bigger prayer shawl you had, and the longer your fringes were. You knew somebody by their wealth, by how long their fringes were. So that is a really good picture of what a priest's prayer shawl would look like. There's some other things to pass out that show that. If you, yeah, thank you. Pass that around. The colors were usually crimson, purple, or royal blue as outlined in the Torah. The prayer shawl or tallit also served, oh, this is interesting, as the banner for the tribes, identifying them. Certain tribes had certain colors, and the knots were tied in a certain way, which identified the wearer. This is what we would call macrame today. How different people did their knots differently that identified them. If you found or saw a prayer shawl, say, laid over the back of a bench or something, you would know immediately who that belonged to, because all you had to do is look at the knots. You say, oh, that's his signature right there. That's his signature. Now, I can see the Israelites marching for 40 years through the desert, divided into their birth tribes, and a banner carrier with their colors that each person would have on their own prayer shawl that was in that tribe. Wow, I got goosebumps just thinking about it. Isn't that an amazing thing to know that that as Moses began the genealogy and dividing the people into their birth tribes and teaching them about their heritage, then each tribe had their own colors and their own banners. So God created a place, or a sanctuary, for his people. He literally abode in the wings of the tallit. It signified his presence with them at all times. Psalm 61:4, David says, "Let me dwell in your tent, tallit, forever, and let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings." He's talking about his prayer shawl when we talk about wings and tents. Okay, much of what takes place concerning the tallit is custom. An Ethiopian Jew will not have the same customs as a Russian Jew. They'll just be different customs. And even from community to community, they may have different customs. Let's look at what the Bible has to say about the prayer shawl. If we look at David, we know David was a shepherd. I can see David out in the desert, out in the oasis with his sheep, watching over his sheep. Okay, this is a desert area. This is not a tropical area. It's not like Florida. It's like California. It's a desert area. It's very, very hot. If you've ever been to Palm Springs, you can barely breathe the air. It's so hot. Our son was in Iraq twice. He said, "Mama, it gets up to 130 degrees, and the wind blows. It's like you're in a clothes dryer." He said, "You can hardly breathe the air. The wind is blowing so hard, and it's 130 degrees. Okay, so I can see David out there. He's taking care of his sheep. He has his wool tallit over his head. It keeps the sun off of his head. It gives him shade, gives him a way to escape during the day. But at night, the temperature can drop 50 to 60 degrees. It can get very, very cold, near freezing at night. We lived in California for a while, you learn you never go anywhere without a jacket. You may leave in the daytime and it's hot, but by evening, if you're coming back from a movie or something, it's cold. It's desert cold. And so David had his prayer shawl to wrap up in as his blanket. If it rained, that wool shed the rain. It was tightly woven. It just shed the rain just as good as any umbrella. And so David had his prayer shawl. And the story of David, I really like this part. This is from 1 Samuel 24. If you want to make a note, you can look it up later. But I'll just tell you the story. You know, Saul and his army was pursuing David and a little band of men that were following. And Saul was trying to kill David. Saul had gone mad. He was paranoid. He thought David was trying to kill him. And they're on the West Bank, which is mountainous area. The West Bank is right between Israel and Jordan, and it's a mountainous area, and there were caves there. Okay, so David and his little band of men goes into a deep, deep cave, and in one translation they call it a lion's den. They went into this lion's den and to rest. They got out of the heat of the day. They were in this cool cave back in the mountains. And so they lay down to rest. And lo and behold, a little bit later, King Saul comes in. Now, the Bible says King Saul came in to relieve himself. He had to go to the bathroom. And so he came in to this cave. Well, David's band is way back in the back, and Saul's up here by the mouth of the cave. He has his soldiers posted. He has privacy, and he's telling them, leave me alone. You know, they're at the mouth of the cave, and he's safe. And so he lays down, spreads out his prayer shawl, and lays down on his prayer shawl and goes to sleep, a deep sleep. He was relaxed. He knew he was safe, and he was relaxed. David's little band of men says, look, God has given you the enemy. Look, kill him. Kill him now. God has given him to you. He sleeps right there. You can just kill him in his sleep. And David says, no, I will not touch God's anointed. I will not do that. But this is what David does. He goes up to where Saul is asleep on his prayer shawl. Okay. And he has a knife. Now, the Bible, my King James says he cuts the corner off of his robe. Well, he cut the fringe off of the king's robe, the tzitzit off of the king's robe. Well, everybody knows the king's robe, the king's fringe is going to be the most beautiful in the land. Everybody would recognize the king's fringe, wouldn't they? It probably had even silver or gold woven into it, and was long. So he cut the fringe off of the corner of King Saul's prayer shawl. Talit. Okay, in the morning, the king gets up, puts on his shawl, goes out, and as he leaves, David in his little group goes the other way, up onto a cliff. And as they all gather together, David calls out, Saul, Saul, here I am, here I am. And Saul says, wow, I didn't know we were that close. And David says, Saul, I could have killed you last night, but I did not. You are not my enemy. I do not intend to kill you. Look, I was this close to you. And he holds up the king's fringe, tzitzit. He holds it up. And Saul is just flabbergasted, and all the army is flabbergasted. Of course, they recognize this is, what are you doing with my fringe? You've taken the fringe off of my shawl. Saul has a change of heart almost immediately. And he says to David, I know you will be king. I know that. And I ask this one thing of you. And David says, what? What do you want? He said, don't kill all of my family. That was the thing that the next ruler would do. He would kill the family of the previous ruler and do away with that line. And so David says to Saul, I will do that for you. I will not kill all of your family. And that made a big mess when he didn't do that. The nation split. There was pretenders to the throne. Saul's descendants felt they had a right to the throne, and David had stolen it, and they made trouble. The whole time they made trouble because David did not do that. But he told Saul he would not do that. And so I love that story. And if you just say he cut the corner of his shawl, you don't realize what that was. You have to know what that was that he cut. Okay, we see Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel wrapped himself in his prayer shawl. The lions never came near him. He just walked right through them. The lions. Then we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire. They went into the fire. They covered themselves with their prayer shawl, and not a hair on their head was singed. Not a hair on their head. Oh, and then we have Joseph with this coat of many colors. And you know, this is not a Dolly Parton coat. When we stop and think about the coat of many colors, we think of a coat, a patchwork coat. Okay, let me tell you about Joseph's coat. This coat was important enough that it nearly got him killed. Okay, Joseph was just a young man. He was probably about 13 years old. And he had older brothers. Joseph was his daddy, Jacob's favorite son. And the other brothers were jealous, and Joseph kind of rubbed it in. You know, if you ever notice, he told him about the dreams that God gave him and that he was going to be over them, and he rubbed it in. He needed a little wisdom along there as a child, you know. But on his birthday, probably his 13th birthday, his daddy, Jacob, gave him his prayer shawl. And it was gorgeous. It was a beautiful prayer shawl. Custom has it that this prayer shawl belonged to Abraham, that this was Joseph's great-great-grandfather's prayer shawl. It belonged to Abraham. And it was many, many colors. Now this prayer shawl is called a Joseph's shawl. And you can see it has much more color in it than this little one that I'm wearing. But I have seen them with silver and gold embroidery all over them in colors that would just burst like these gorgeous, gorgeous colors. And I imagine that's what this coat, this prayer shawl, or coat as they call it in the Bible, was that Joseph had. It was the last straw. It was the last straw for the brothers. They said, okay, we're not taking this anymore. And that's when they threw him in a pit and they sold him into slavery, and he ended up in Egypt. So I love the story of Elijah and Elisha. Elijah, the prophet, had gone, you know, the story, he'd gone to the widow woman and told her to feed him, and she had just a little bit of oil and a little bit of meal, and she fed him, and it never went away. They had food all through the famine. And then the widow's son died. And the widow says to Elijah, did you save us just for me to go through this? Why did you save us if my son was going to die? Why did you not just let me die too? And Elijah takes his tallit, and lays it across the boy, and the boy comes back to life. And that was one of the miracles that the prophet Elijah did. Now, Elijah and Elisha were walking through the wilderness, and there was a band of people following them. Most of the band were priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, some just general crowd following the prophet of God. And so Elijah and Elisha, who was his, sidekick, Elisha wanted to be like Elijah. Okay, so they're walking through this area, and they come to a brook, a stream, water that they needed to cross. And Elisha looks at Elijah and says, Master, what are we going to do? And Elijah takes his prayer shawl, and he takes the fringe right here, takes the 4 fringes, and get them right here, and he does this with the fringe. He just lines this, what they call it, a mantle, and hits the water, and it just opens up. It just spreads, and they walk across on the dry land. Well, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the wouldn't sees and couldn't see, they see that. wow, that is a man of God. And so they go on to the place where Elijah's going, and we know that he's transfigured. He goes into heaven, and as he's walking with Elisha, he says, "What do you want from me? What do you?" And Elisha says, "I want a double portion of what you have." And Elijah says, "If you see me when I leave, you shall have it." And so Elisha is standing there, and they're talking, and Elijah is beginning to leave. And Elisha reaches up and grabs a hold of the fringe on his robe and pulls it off of him and has it as he leaves. And so by now the Pharisees and the Sadducees have caught up with him, and they say, "What do you think you're doing? Just because you've got the master's shawl doesn't mean you have anything else." And of course, Elisha's on the other side of this stream, you remember, and they haven't crossed the stream. And so Elisha's a funny little man. Some of the books that I've read describe Elisha. They say he's a little small Jew, a little small man, bald, mostly bald, the big hook nose, but he has a little high, squeaky voice. And the Pharisees and the crowd say, "Who do you think's going to follow you? Nobody's going to. You're not a prophet of God. You have no authority. Who's going to follow you?" And Elisha takes the prayer shawl that he has in his hand that has come from the prophet, and he walks to the stream, and he winds it up, and he slaps the water, and it parts for him. And the crowd is like this, what in the world? Look what has happened here. Maybe he does have some authority. Maybe he is God's prophet. Maybe that mantle has been passed to him. And they use the term even today of passing the mantle as passing the authority or to the next person with the mantle. In the New Testament, we know the story of Jesus, and he's ministering, and his fame has gone out to this area, and there's a huge crowd around him, and the little woman with the issue of blood. She's had an issue of blood for 12 years. She's spent all her money. Probably her husband's left her because she's unclean. You could not even sit down in a place where she had sat, because that would make you unclean too. That husband couldn't live in that house with her and go to the synagogue. He would be unclean too if he lived in the house with her. So her husband's probably left her too. So we see this little woman has heard of his healing power, and she comes to see him, and you can just see this little woman, and she's, of course, this is a masculine society. We know that the women have no power at all, and the man has all the power. Women have nothing. And here's this little woman, and she comes and she sees the crowd, and she does this, and she starts pushing her way through this crowd. Every man that she's touched is now unclean. Every person that she's touched, every man. So she gets right up to Jesus, and she falls on her face, and she touches the wings. The Bible says the hem of his garment. It's the same word that's used as wings in other translations. She touches the wings. The healing is in the wings. The healing is in the wings. And if I can just touch the wings of his garment, I'll be healed. And immediately Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples say, "What do you mean, Lord? Everybody's touching you." No, somebody. There's virtue gone out of me. I felt it. And there's the little woman. Well, the men, all these unclean men, now Jesus is unclean too, because she's touched him. All these unclean men, they're ready to stone her. A woman does not touch another man other than her husband or her father, and certainly not his prayer shawl, his talit. A woman that was not your wife or your daughter could be stoned if she touched your prayer shawl. And so what does Jesus do? Immediately he reaches down and says, daughter, daughter, daughter. He diffuses the crowd. He calls her daughter, and which diffuses the crowd as for wanting to kill him. And then he goes right on to Jairus' house, and Jairus' daughter has already died. He was headed there when the crowd stopped him. And the mother of the little daughter says, it's too late. It's too late. She's dead. And Jesus says, no, she just sleeps. She just sleeps. But see, Jesus is already unclean. He's still unclean. He's not been cleansed yet. And he goes into the dead body. The dead body, if you touch the dead body, you are then unclean if you weren't before. But he's already unclean. And he takes his prayer shawl and he lays it over her and puts the wings in her hands. And he says to her, Talitha Kumi. Now, the Bible translates that as girl, arise. Literally, it is girl in the talit. Talitha, girl in the talit, arise. And she arises from the dead. Christ is crucified, and he was covered with a talit in the tomb. Even today in Israel, a casket is not used for burial. The body is cleansed and wrapped in their prayer shawl. Usually the person's, if it's a man, is wrapped in and then buried in the ground. There's not a casket. Peter came to the tomb, and the Bible says the burial napkin was folded in the corner. Okay, Peter knew immediately that that was a prayer shawl that had been folded by a Jew. There is a way, like we have a certain way we fold our American flag, and we know that that was folded by people who know how to. Okay, there's a way that they fold the talit that Peter knew immediately that was not folded by a Roman, a soldier who stole him. That was folded by a Jew. Peter, again, at Cornelius' house on the roof, saw a vision of a sheet held by the four corners. Well, it was a prayer shawl held by the four fringes, okay? And it came filled with unclean things, and this was a prayer shawl. And at that time, Peter became a missionary to the Gentiles. Paul's occupation is stated as a tent maker. Paul lived in Corinth, which is a seaport. Corinth is a city of stone, mostly marble, to survive the rugged seacoast winds. Paul was a rabbinical student. He was studying to be a rabbi. Even today, the rabbinical students make prayer shawls to support themselves while they're studying. So I will just tell you that Paul's tent making was prayer shawl making. I don't think he was a tent maker. That nobody would buy a tent in Corinth. They could not stand the seacoast winds. So when it and the talit is translated little tent. That's the translation for that word. So maybe this is a stretch. If you think this is a stretch, throw it away. But I think it's interesting. I think Paul was probably making prayer shawls, not tents. Okay. So I've probably gone far enough. The prayer shawl is to bring the people close to God. As you wrap yourself in the prayer shawl, you have a physical symbol of awareness that you are secure in God's presence, being under the shadow of his wings. So I imagine there's lots of questions. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask me about the prayer shawl? I might know. I can hear you talking, but I can't understand you. Okay, no. This is, okay, the Jews are very particular about men and women not wearing each other's clothes. And this would have been very much against their laws for a woman to put on a piece of cloth that was a man's garment. However, in modern days, sometimes they will allow certain rabbis, if they speak on it and say, yes, I think they should, or it's okay, if it's not, and this is interesting, if it's not a form of rebellion, if they just want to wear it and worship, in this day and age, it is accepted. Never in biblical times. Never in biblical times. And never in certain areas. But, you know, the United States were a little more progressive in some areas. And so some of the American Jews do, women do wear a prayer shawl. You have a question? I don't know how they fold it, but that would be interesting to find out. Yeah, because we would know if we saw a flag folded, we would know immediately that somebody, an American, did that. And that's the way they were too. So I hope you've enjoyed this and learned something, and that's interesting. In this day and age, you can pick your own colors. And I just went, Adam, I wish you had brought yours. I wish I'd gotten a hold of you and said, bring yours. Adam and I talk about the prayer shawl occasionally. In fact, he stopped me in the foyer one Sunday morning and he said, look here what I found. And he had the story of Ruth and Boaz. And you know where it talks about Boaz being asleep on the threshing floor, and Ruth goes in and lays at his feet and covers her feet with his prayer shawl. Yeah, and Adam says, look, I found another place where the prayer shawl is, you know, and I thought, and it's fun to do that. And now that you know what we're talking about, the more you read, the more these things will jump out at you. You'll see this as you read. You'll say, oh, this was a prayer shawl. Yes, back then they, whatever tribe they belonged to, that was the colors that they wore. But today, I just went on the internet and bought what color I wanted. Okay, I can't hear a word you're saying. and you wanted to wear a prayer shawl, there will be a stack of prayer shawls off to the side, and you are welcome to pick it up and wear it while you're in the front of us. And then just fold it up and put it back. You don't want to look at this? This is very, very fine material. And the neck piece is really embroidered. Also, some of the Middle Eastern Jews have their prayer shawls made out of silk. And nowadays, you may find one with polyester.
I know back in Bible times, they had, so of course, if they were angry or if they were in despair, they would rip their clothes. Is that what they did?
Probably. Probably. We will have to research that a little bit more to find out for sure. Okay. Pastor Dave, I'm through with my program. If you have anything else to say.